1868, and the engine room of a Manchester spinning mill is already running when the morning shift arrives. The air dense with cylinder oil and the fine white dust of scorched cotton lint. The floor transmitting a low subsonic vibration through the soles of every boot. Not a sound so much as a pressure, a permanent physical fact of the building itself. Something the men stopped noticing years ago the way they stopped noticing the smell. The engine man stands with one hand resting on the throttle housing, not because it needs him, but because that is where he has always stood. And the governor, a paired set of brass balls spinning on jointed arms above the valve linkage, rotates in its calibrated arc at 340 revolutions per minute, exactly where it should be. Exactly as it has been every morning for years, every afternoon, every night shift, in every season, in every condition of load and weather that the mill has thrown at it. This machine has completed by any reasonable estimate 50 million regulation cycles without failure. That is the point. That is precisely the point. A boy oiler passes the governor column on his circuit of the floor, a bucket in each hand, not glancing at the linkage rod because there is no reason to glance at the linkage rod. The binding has been accumulating in the guide collar for 6 weeks, a compound of lint fiber, degraded oil, and the slow misalignment of a steel pin worn a fraction of a millimeter past its tolerance. Nobody logged it. The engine accelerates past 420 revolutions per minute. The flywheel, 8 tons of cast iron, 14 feet across, leaves its shaft in 3 pieces. One section travels 60 feet through the mill wall. 4 men are in the engine room. 2 leave it standing. It was not built to let engines run away. It was built to make runaway impossible. So why, across 4 decades and a dozen industries, did the centrifugal governor fail at the precise moment that control mattered most? To understand how this ended, you have to go back to 1788, to James Watt, to Birmingham, and to a commercial problem that had no solution yet. The rotative steam engine was, in the mid-1780s, the most powerful prime mover humanity had ever concentrated in a single room. And Matthew Boulton understood before most of his competitors that it would only sell to the textile trade if it could do one thing: the reciprocating pump engine could not run at a consistent speed. Arkwright's mills required constant shaft rotation. Thread quality depended on it absolutely. A variation of more than 10% above or below the design speed would snap warp threads, jam shuttle timing, and reduce an entire shift's production to unsellable scrap. Boulton told Watt, with characteristic commercial directness recorded in their surviving Birmingham correspondence, that without a regulator, the rotative engine had no future in the mills. Watt solved it with a mechanism borrowed from millwrights who had been using similar devices on windmills and grinding mills for decades. 2 brass balls, each weighing roughly 3 pounds, mounted on hinged arms attached to a rotating spindle geared to the engine shaft. As shaft speed rose, centrifugal force drove the balls outward and upward. As they rose, the linkage geometry pulled a throttle valve progressively closed, reducing steam flow, slowing the engine back toward its set point. As speed fell, the balls dropped, the valve opened, and the engine recovered. The physics were elegant. The restoring force scaled with the square of the rotational speed, which meant the governor responded more aggressively the further the engine deviated from its target, a self-correcting loop that seemed, to everyone who first encountered it, like a small mechanical miracle. Watt filed the design in 1788. William Murdoch, his most trusted practical engineer at the Soho foundry, oversaw early production and installation. The mills bought it immediately. Here is the first twist, and it is the one that makes everything else inevitable. The governor was not a safety device. It was a quality control instrument. It existed to keep thread uniform and looms synchronized, to protect product, not people. Its secondary effect, preventing catastrophic overspeed, was a consequence of its primary function, not its stated purpose, and that distinction mattered enormously from the first day an engine left the foundry. Because the flywheel, which the governor nominally protected, was not a passive component. It was an energy reservoir, a deliberate accumulator of rotational mass, and the energy stored inside it scaled with every pound added to its rim and with the square of every revolution per minute added to its speed. A 6-ton flywheel spinning at 120 revolutions per minute stores kinetic energy equivalent to a substantial artillery shell. The larger the flywheel, The smoother the power delivery across the mill floor, and smooth power delivery was exactly what the textile trade was paying for. So mills demanded heavier flywheels, larger diameters, greater stored energy, and the governor, a 3-pound brass mechanism connected to its throttle by a steel rod running through a bronze-bushed collar, was the only thing standing between all that accumulated energy and the building wrapped around it. Watt had built a machine that could think. What he had not built was a machine that could stop thinking. The first generation of governor-fitted engines entered the mills with no centralized maintenance protocol. The Soho foundry trained its own engineers, but once an engine was installed and producing revenue, the mill owner paid for the machine, not for ongoing calibration expertise from Birmingham. Local millwrights who serviced these engines learned by proximity and habit, not by theoretical instruction from anyone who understood the underlying mechanics. The linkage that connected the governor balls to the throttle valve ran through guide collars, bronze bushings through which a steel rod translated rotational motion into linear valve displacement. Those collars required weekly lubrication and monthly inspection for wear and alignment. In practice, they received neither on any consistent schedule. The machine worked. No one asked why or for how long. After Watt's patents expired in 1800, the governor became a commodity component, and the industry that grew around it had no interest in preserving the calibration logic behind the original geometry. Foundries across Lancashire, Yorkshire, and the Midlands copied the design from working examples rather than from Watt's engineering drawings, often without understanding the precise relationship between ball mass, arm length, spindle gear ratio, and the specific throttle resistance of the valve the governor was meant to drive. Governor ball weights ranged across manufacturers from 2 pounds to more than 8, installed in mills running engines of wildly varying power outputs and flywheel masses, with no engineering standard governing any of it. By the time parliamentary returns on steam engine usage were compiled in the late 1830s, Britain had hundreds of rotative engines running with centrifugal governors in textile mills alone, and the men responsible for maintaining those governors operated entirely from accumulated habit. There were now, by any reasonable estimate, 1,000 governors in Britain. There was no one who knew all the ways they could fail. The mill itself, by the 1840s, had become a single interlocked mechanical organism with the engine at its heart and the governor at the center of the engine's authority. A horizontal engine shaft ran at ceiling height through the length of the building. Driving line shafting on every floor through bevel gears and wide flat leather belts that slapped rhythmically against wooden guides at every quarter turn. Every spinning frame, every power loom, every preparing and winding machine in the building drew its speed from that one shaft. And every one of those machines had been timed and calibrated at the engine's design speed. A speed increase of 15% above the design point meant every machine in the building accelerated by 15% simultaneously. Thread broke. Shuttles arrived at their reversal points a fraction of a second early and jammed. Operatives whose hands moved near moving machinery at rhythms they had learned over years of work suddenly found those rhythms wrong in ways they could not immediately identify. Factory inspector reports from the Home Office records in this period document hand injuries with a numbing regularity that conceals their mechanical cause entirely. The machine was not malfunctioning, it was running fast. The governor was not correcting it, and nobody had yet decided whose fault that was. The engine keeper, whose name in most surviving records appears only as a surname or a job title, performed his daily circuit of the engine room with the methodical calm of a man who had done the same walk 1,000 times. Oil reservoirs checked, valve packing inspected, gland nuts given a half turn, governor spindle glanced at. That last item glanced at. The governor was trusted because it had never visibly failed. That was the most dangerous sentence in British industrial engineering. What the engine keepers were observing without recording was a phenomenon that engineers would eventually call hunting the governor oscillating above and below its set point rather than converging to it, causing the throttle to cycle open and closed in a rhythmic surge that transmitted through the engine as a periodic variation in shaft speed, felt on the mill floor as a subtle but measurable pulse. A deviation from the constant thrum that should have been a warning and instead became, through sheer repetition, background noise. James Clerk Maxwell described this instability with complete mathematical precision in a paper published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society in 1868. demonstrating through differential equations that a governor without sufficient damping in its linkage would, under the load variations typical of any working mill, oscillate rather than regulate, and that the oscillations would worsen, not stabilize, as the linkage wore and friction in the guide collars increased. The paper was precise, complete, and entirely correct. It was read by mathematicians, by professional engineers in the learned institutions, by men who spent their working days in offices rather than on mill floors. It was not read by millwrights. When a mill engine surged and a foreman filed a complaint, the blame landed reliably on the engine driver, a careless hand on the throttle, an improperly managed fire, insufficient attention to the steam pressure gauge. The governor was never questioned because the governor was the solution. Questioning it would have meant admitting that the solution had a failure mode, and the institution had no mechanism for that admission. A design flaw had become a personnel problem, and it remained one for 2 more decades while the flywheels grew larger and the stored energy climbed. By the late 1850s, mill owners across the Lancashire cotton districts were ordering flywheels that reached 12 and 14 feet in diameter, with masses exceeding 10 and sometimes 15 tons. Because the commercial logic was unambiguous, a heavier flywheel meant smoother shaft speed under varying load. Smoother shaft speed meant better product quality. Better product quality meant contracts and margins. The kinetic energy stored in a rotating flywheel scales with the square of its angular velocity, which means an engine running 20% above its design speed does not carry 20% more destructive energy in its flywheel. It carries nearly 50% more. The governor's functional strength, its ability to hold the engine at a consistent target speed and thereby allow the flywheel to perform its role as a power buffer, was structurally inseparable from the catastrophe that its failure would produce. The larger and more effective the flywheel, the more essential the governor's function. The larger and heavier the flywheel, the more catastrophic the governor's failure. No engineering standard in this period capped flywheel mass relative to governor authority. No insurance requirement mandated governor inspection intervals or linkage replacement cycles. The industry had built the most rational, most productive, most carefully engineered power system available to it. It was also, under the precise conditions that produced binding in a guide collar, the largest concentrated energy release mechanism in any civilian building in England. They had built the largest bomb. They called it the safest system in the plant. The failure, when it arrived in its fully realized form, followed the sequence that the engineering logic had been composing for 3 decades. The linkage seizes, not suddenly, but through the patient accumulation of wear and contamination across weeks or months. Lint fiber packing into the collar gap, oil degrading from a lubricant into an abrasive paste. A pin losing its clearance fraction by fraction until the friction in the guide collar finally exceeds the restoring force that the governor balls can generate at normal operating speed. The balls freeze in their low position. The throttle valve, commanded by a rod that has stopped moving, stays open. Steam continues to flow. The engine accelerates. The governor, spinning faster now as the engine climbs, generates increasing centrifugal force, but the seized linkage cannot transmit it. The balls swing outward against the mechanical constraint of the frozen collar. The spindle turns faster, and the engine continues to climb past its governed range into territory where the only remaining limit is the tensile strength of the flywheel rim itself. Cast iron fractures without warning under hoop stress. There is no plastic deformation, no slow tearing, no creak of material giving way. The rim reaches its limit and it simply becomes shrapnel, radial cracks propagating at the speed of sound through the casting. The flywheel disintegrating in a single event that contemporary witnesses consistently described as resembling artillery fire. Debris traveled 40, 60, and in documented cases more than 100 feet, passing through brick walls and timber floors with the indifference of material traveling at ballistic velocities. Workers on adjacent floors, men and women who had no knowledge that anything was wrong in the engine room below, were killed by cast iron moving through the structure of the building they were standing in. The governor had not malfunctioned. It had done precisely what a seized linkage commanded it to do: nothing. The coroner's inquest that followed each such event was conducted with genuine care and appropriate legal thoroughness. Debris fields were walked and measured. Trajectories were documented. Witnesses gave testimony that was recorded verbatim. The mechanical sequence of events was, in many cases, correctly identified by technically literate inspectors who understood that the governor linkage had failed to respond and that the flywheel had consequently exceeded its safe rotational limit. The cause of death was established without ambiguity, and the verdict was accidental death, with a letter recommending that the mill owner ensure regular inspection of moving engine components. The governor design was not named as a systemic risk. No central authority collected and cross-referenced inquest records from different mills in different counties to build a pattern. No engineering institution was mandated to analyze the accumulated evidence and propose design standards. Each failure was a discrete event. Each inquest was a discrete proceeding. They wrote down everything that happened. They did not write down how to prevent it happening in the next mill, with the next governor, on the next morning shift. Improved governor designs were available before the era ended. Spring-loaded mechanisms that added damping directly to the linkage, addressing Maxwell's instability at its mechanical root, appeared in engineering catalogs through the 1870s and 1880s. Wrought iron and later steel flywheels, which could deform plastically under overstress rather than shattering into projectiles, entered the market for new installations. The Factory and Workshop Acts were amended repeatedly across this period, extending regulatory reach into more areas of mill machinery, but the internal dynamics of the engine governor remained outside the practical scope of inspection. Adoption of improved designs was voluntary, economically rational only when an engine reached the end of its service life and replacement became unavoidable. Retrofitting a working mill meant a production shutdown, and a production shutdown had a calculable cost that the mill owner could set against the probability of failure as he understood it from his own experience, which was, in most cases, no failure yet. The solution existed. The economics of installing it did not. What ended the centrifugal governor's reign was not reform but elimination. The AC electric motor, commercially viable for industrial drive applications by the mid-1890s, required no governor at all. Its rotational speed was determined by the frequency of the alternating current supply, 50 cycles per second in the British system, producing a shaft speed that held within fractions of a percent under any normal production load, without any mechanical regulation whatsoever. The entire problem, linkage friction, hunting instability, cast iron hoop stress, the catastrophic release of stored flywheel energy through a seized collar was architecturally removed from the system. Not regulated, not redesigned, removed, by eliminating the variable that had required control. Mills that converted to electric drive in the first decade of the 20th century decommissioned their steam engines, dismissed their engine keepers in the old sense of the role, and in several documented cases simply bricked over the engine pit and the flywheel within it, the mass too great to extract, without demolishing the floor above. The brass balls of the governor hung motionless for the first time in 80 years. The floor above retained the slight grooves worn by decades of vibration-driven settling, the only remaining physical record of what had run there. The equation Maxwell had written in 1868 remained correct. It simply no longer applied to anything that was killing people. The machine did not fail. The institution that ran it did. And the only thing that stopped the dying was a technology that made the argument irrelevant.